Hey everyone, Noah Zerbe here. In this video, we're going to briefly look at the democratic peace hypothesis, which is a central component of liberal international relations theory. So what is the democratic peace hypothesis? Put simply, it's the observation that democracies rarely go to war with one another. Now notice that I did not assert that democracies are necessarily more peaceful than non-democracies. Indeed, the research on the democratic peace hypothesis suggests that while democracies don't generally go to war with one another, they're just as likely as non-democracies to go to war overall. They generally just fight against non-democratic adversaries. And the data on this seems to hold up. According to the Correlates of War project, between 1816 and 2008, there were nearly 100 interstate wars, that is, wars fought between states. Of those, only one was fought between two liberal democracies. Now, these numbers are necessarily fuzzy, and in part they depend on how we define both war and democracy. What makes a war a war? Does it require a formal declaration? If so, the United States has not been involved in a war since World War II. Does it require a minimum certain number of casualties or a certain length of hostilities, a minimum number of deaths, or a certain number of soldiers involved? And similarly, what makes a country a democracy? Is it universal enfranchisement? If so, the United States is still not a democracy. Is it liberalism, the protection of civil and political rights? And at what point does a country become a democracy? Most of the conflicts between democracies involve relatively young democracies or non-liberal democracies, and if we exclude these categories, the number of wars between democracies drops to zero. At the same time, remember that democracies are not necessarily any more pacifist than non-democracies. That is, democracies fight in wars as frequently as non-democracies do, just not against one another. There are several different ways to think about the democratic peace. On a monadic level, that is, dealing only with one state, are democracies more peaceful in their overall relations than other states? The evidence suggests that they're not. That is, democratic states are not any less likely to use force in their foreign relations than are authoritarian states. That said, the evidence does suggest that when democratic states do resort to the use of force in their foreign policy, they are more likely to engage in limited rather than full-scale conflicts, they're generally less willing to escalate disputes into actual war, and they're generally less likely to initiate the use of force against another state. And interestingly, when they do engage in war, democracies are more likely to win than non-democratic states. On a dyadic level, that is, looking at relations between states, are democracies more peaceful in their relations with other democracies than they are in their dealings with non-democracies? Here, the evidence actually suggests that they are. Democracies generally maintain more peaceful relations with other democracies, but authoritarian states are not necessarily any more peaceful in their relations with other authoritarian states. In other words, there appears to be something unique about the relationship between democratic states that sets them apart. And finally, what about at a systematic level? Would a world filled with democratic states necessarily be more peaceful? This third question is at the heart of Immanuel Kant's 1795 manuscript, Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch, which represents one of the earliest efforts to outline the democratic peace. In it, Kant concludes that republics, and he distinguishes between republics and democracies, that republics would be less likely to go to war, and that an international system comprised of just republics would necessarily be more peaceful. Indeed, he writes that if the consent of the citizens is required in order to decide that a war should be declared, nothing is more natural that they would be very cautious in commencing such a poor game, decreeing for themselves all the calamities of war. Those calamities, according to Kant, include the possibility of citizens being sent off to fight in the war, of having to bear the cost of the war through taxes, of dealing with the devastation wrought by war, and other issues. In other words, because in a republic or a democracy, the citizens both influence the decision-making on whether or not to go to war and bear the cost of that decision, they're not likely to support war. Public support for any war would necessarily be a precondition for engaging in that war, and the people would likely punish their elected leaders for decisions that led a country into unnecessary wars. Thus, according to Kant, republics are necessarily more peaceful. By contrast, Kant concludes that in a non-democratic system, that is, in a country where political decisions are not under the control of the citizens, a declaration of war is the easiest thing in the world to decide upon because war does not require the ruler sacrificing anything. From this, Kant concludes that a federation of independent republics would be best positioned to maintain cooperative relations and peaceful international systems. While Kant's idea of perpetual peace was the most well-known articulation of the idea, he's hardly alone in his observation. The American revolutionary leader Thomas Paine wrote in his pamphlet Common Sense, "The republics of Europe are all, and we may say always, in peace." Indeed, like Kant, Paine believed that kings would go to war out of a misplaced sense of pride, where republics would not. And similarly, Alexis de Tocqueville concluded in his book Democracy in America that democracies were less likely to engage in war, concluding that among civilized nations, warlike passions become rarer and less active as social conditions get nearer to equality. In other words, for de Tocqueville, property rights dampened the push to war and predisposed citizens to a more peaceful foreign policy. Notwithstanding the observations of Kant and others, the idea of perpetual peace was not institutionalized until after World War I. Efforts after World War I to establish a collective security mechanism through the League of Nations, a topic we examine in another video, might have been seen as an early effort to create an international mechanism to promote Kant's perpetual peace. The failure of the League of Nations and the outbreak of the Cold War put the idea of the democratic peace on the back burner, but the end of the Cold War in 1989 or 1991 rekindled interest in that theory. Indeed, in 1992, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker asserted that the Cold War has ended, and now we have a chance to forge a democratic peace, an enduring peace built on shared values, democracy and political and economic freedom. The strength of these values in Russia and the other new independent states will be the surest foundation for peace and the strongest guarantee of our national security for decades to come. This theme was common in the period immediately after the breakup of the Soviet Union, as witnessed by another widely discussed text at the time, Francis Fukuyama's End of History. In it, Fukuyama argues that the ideological debates and conflicts that defined the post-World War II era had ended, with liberal democracy as the victor. For Fukuyama, there was no form of government or economic organization that could supplant liberal democracy and capitalism. We had reached the end of history. So if we take the narrowest understanding of the democratic peace, that democracies don't go to war with other democracies, can we explain why this is? There are three possible explanations. The first is structural. As Kant suggested, the structure of liberal democracies may mitigate against the use of force in foreign policy. Representative governments have institutional features that hold elected officials accountable to the electorate. Because wars are costly and risky, there's a strong institutional incentive for leaders to avoid using force, particularly if the conflict may be protracted and costly. The second reason is normative. There may be expectations of behavior or norms that emerge in the context of domestic politics that translate into foreign policy. That is, in a democratic polis, policies and debates are expected to be resolved through peaceful means, most often through political campaigns and elections or the courts. Democracies may expect other democracies to behave in a similar way, creating a norm at the international level that promotes the nonviolent resolution of disputes through international organizations and forums. The third explanation is rooted in the idea of interdependence. Democracies frequently have strong economic ties and are generally well-established states. They may therefore be less likely to resort to the use of force to resolve territorial disputes, as they stand to lose out economically if war breaks out. As conceptualized today, the democratic peace is a stool with three legs, that is, three elements. And if you've already watched the neoliberalism video, this should look somewhat familiar. The first is liberal democracy at the domestic political level. The second is economic interdependence. That is, the idea that democracies are connected through complex interdependence, and that basically the idea of close economic ties between countries reduces the likelihood of conflict between them. Finally, international organizations are central to promoting connections between states and in providing an avenue for the peaceful resolutions of disputes between countries. Examples of this might include formal channels like the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement mechanism or the UN Security Council, but it might also include the informal channels of diplomacy and negotiation developed through policy discussion and exchange. Now, I want to conclude with a brief word of caution. The idea that democracies are less conflict-prone has been used as a justification to promote democratization around the world. It was implicit in the quote from Secretary of State James Baker we saw earlier, and we see it promoted by U.S. President Bill Clinton, who argued in his 1994 State of the Union address that democracies don't attack one another. Ultimately, the best strategy to ensure our security and to build a durable peace is to support the advance of democracy elsewhere. Ironically, his assertion was used to support expanding U.S. military and defense budgets. But it has also led to U.S. military intervention to force democratization in countries around the world. But such efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and historically across Latin America and Asia, have rarely been successful in creating a stable liberal democratic system, let alone in achieving the conditions necessary for a democratic peace. Indeed, in many cases, the weak form of democracy instituted under foreign pressure has intensified domestic political conflict in these countries, sometimes resulting even in civil wars. So that concludes our brief discussion of the democratic peace hypothesis. Feel free to leave any questions you have in the comment section below, and thanks for watching. Bye.